thank you everybody for joining at our afternoon session for the first day of the Future Law Virtual Summit 2020. It's great to see you back, Magda. To just briefly introduce our next speaker, Magda Theodate. You are a public procurement expert. You're a seasoned trade policy attorney, and you've been with us when we kicked off the COVID Global Policy Response Database structure. And also you've been joining in our effort to write to the UN policy response or a suggestion on how we might actually create the model provisions for the crisis public procurement. So it's been great working with you. I've enjoyed it very much, and we all have received the certificate of excellence from the UN. So it's really been an amazing experience. But I'll give you the floor to represent yourself and to tell us a bit more about the emerging technology and practice, which is going to be an incredible session, I believe.
Thank you so much, Anya. You're right. Some people think I'm a procurement expert. Other people think I'm a trade lawyer. I think I'm both. And I get to apply those skills, thankfully, through my work as Director of Global Executive Trade Consulting, which is a trade and procurement advisory consulting firm based in Belize. I primarily work with developing economies or lower and middle income countries, as some might call them. And so much of my experience will be based, and much of what I will be sharing with you today will be from the perspective of developing economies. I would like to share a story, if you don't mind me starting with that, Anya.
Please go ahead.
Okay. You all thought that you were coming here to hear about evolving technologies and how to use them to enhance trade. I want to share a story about shame. I want to share a story about shame because I was born in New York. I'm a US citizen, but my parents are from the developing world. They are from Haiti. You know, Haiti, that country that you always hear is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The Haiti that sometimes just doesn't function right. The Haiti that is the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. First Black independent republic in the Western Hemisphere, but yet has had a lot of trouble from the time of its independence up until today. There's some shame associated with having heritage from the developing world. And what do I mean by that? Well, for a long time, there was shame for me. I'm clearly long over that now. But what I mean by that is, in the developing world, or in economies that are considered developing economies, things don't always work right. Governments don't always do what they're supposed to do. And it's annoying and it's disappointing, and citizens don't always get what they're supposed to get. In fact, often they get the short end of the stick. And for a long time, that brought a lot of shame to me. I didn't like saying that my family was from a developing country. And thankfully, through travel, work, engagement with people from around the world and from the 137 countries that are quote unquote developing countries, according to the World Bank. By the way, the definition for developing economies, according to the World Bank, is a country that that has a gross national income of $11,900 US or less per year, and that does not have a substantial level of well-being, material well-being. So Haiti definitely falls into that category. So where am I going with this? I'm going with this in the direction to tell you that if you are from a non-industrialized country, or what I like to call evolving economy, not developing economy, I like to call evolving economy. If you're from a Haiti or from another country that shares similar socioeconomic characteristics, I would like to say to you that technology is still accessible to you. That digital innovation still applies to you and to your country. You don't have to be from an industrialized country that is extremely well-resourced, or even middle-income country, to have access to digital innovation. And so today, I would like to share a short presentation with you about the big challenge and opportunity that I see post-COVID for evolving economies in using technology. And there's one technology in particular that I'm excited about. And I know, Anya, yours is blockchain. And I love blockchain too, because it's a great control mechanism and it's excellent for transparency. But there's another emerging, I would say, technology, and that is the technology of digital payments and digital currencies. So I would like to share, if you'll allow me to share my screen, a short presentation on what the challenge of digital technologies are, or using digital technologies and digital currencies specifically, and kind of what governments, and particularly governments in evolving economies, can do to use these technologies to facilitate trade. So with that, let me share my screen. What exactly is the challenge that I keep, talking about? I mentioned this challenge. What is it? Well, I wanted to share it with you here. The challenge is, how can governments successfully use the transformative power of technology? Because I do believe it is truly a transformative power. How can governments harness that transformative power, especially the power of digital currencies and digital payments, to make doing business easier throughout the developing world? Because this is one of the greatest challenges that countries that are evolving economies face. Doing business with them can sometimes be a black hole. You don't know how or what or where to go to get information. And you don't exactly know how transactions can be facilitated. I'm not an expert, let me say, on digital currencies. I'm someone who cares about good governance. I care that governments function right. I care that there are opportunities for everybody, and I care that the system in which one does business is fair, transparent, equitable, that we operate with integrity. And I think technology provides that aspect, and I think digital payments can provide that aspect. So I wanted to share a little bit about how governments can maybe respond to this challenge. One, I like to use this acronym called ACA, and it's not a nice fruit. It's an acronym that stands for adaptive, creative, and attentive. I think that governments have to take an adaptive approach when they're dealing with technology. What do I mean by that? I think the very first thing is you have to assess what you have right now. What are your policies? And I know that a lot of policy people will be looking at this video later on, this recording, and they'll be going through with a fine-tooth comb to determine how they can apply some of what we've discussed throughout today and throughout the rest of the week, what we will be discussing in their own context. And I think the very first thing is assessing your policies, your legal frameworks. Look at them and see how they can be adjusted for technology. Because post-COVID, there's not going to be time to think that you can take a digital approach later. It's now that you've got to take a digital approach. So in order to do that, you also need to look at what your risk tolerance is in particular countries. What is the level of tolerance that you're willing to adjust in order to take more risk than you're used to taking? Because in some ways, technology is a risk, particularly in countries that are not used to using technology or don't have wide access to technology. So you have to think about that. And then I'd say, thirdly, look for some specialized skills. If you don't have them locally, you can build them, but while you're building them, hire consultants who can help you. You don't have to hire huge firms that come in, the big four, and redo your entire system. You can start small with pilot projects in local communities where you bring in maybe one or two consultants who can help build that capacity and use that capacity locally to expand through train the trainer programs on technology. I'd also say be creative. And what do I mean by that? Data has always existed. Prior to information technology, you always had data, but countries weren't necessarily using data and making decisions. Now it's a must. We can't let all of the information that we've learned from COVID and all of the information that's available to all of us via the internet and via other platforms go to waste. We have to use that data to make proper decisions linked to COVID and how we treat and act for COVID in order to ensure that lives are saved and that people are able to get back to work. Tech, GovTech in particular, is an innovative, collaborative action between tech sector and the public sector on how to fill the need for technical solutions in the public sector, how to fix problems through technology. And I would say capital. When governments go out, particularly evolving economy governments go out and take loans, they're burdening not just their generation, but future generations. There are other ways to seek capital. Maybe one option is what I call development transformative capital. This is when countries with high income, instead of lending to countries with low income, they can take a portion of their own budget and transfer it to development initiatives. And then that aspect that would have been covered by their own budget for their national needs, they can crowdsource that because people in their countries have the money to be able to support crowdsourcing. And instead of using that money then for loans for evolving economies, that money can be provided in forms of a grant for development aid to evolving economies. So that's one aspect that's very interesting to consider. And then in the attentive category, I would say suppliers are suffering right now. We tend to forget because maybe in your country things are easing with COVID, so you might forget that things are still very, very hard for a lot of countries out there, and particularly for individuals, but also for businesses. Businesses need to pay manufacturers in order for all of us to be able to get goods in our hands. And for that to happen, they need access to capital. And that access to capital, governments have a role to play in easing how that capital gets into the hands of suppliers. And then also labor is stressed. People are out of work. Let's not forget that. In order to get them back to work, governments also have a role to play in using the transformative power of technology through small, micro, medium enterprises to make sure they have access to technologies that can facilitate them getting people back to work and getting trade going. And finally, technology can be used for transparency. So with that, Anya, that long, very introduction, I'd like to stop here and let you kind of lead the questioning that you might have for me at this time. You're muted.
Let me first unmute myself. Yeah. This was very interesting and very much aligned with the lab that we already had. It's interesting how very often when we are thinking or talking about the new technologies, especially blockchain, the word governance comes up. And this is what makes the lab even more so important, perhaps, because it's a new technology that also presents a new political field. So yeah, very much aligned with that. The first question that I have for you, Magda, is how do you see the role of the digital currency and digital payments shaping evolving countries, businesses, and emerging from the challenge that the countries are facing during the COVID-19?
That's a really good question. Look, developing nations do a lot of cash-based business in a very face-to-face way, right? And the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated starkly that digital payments are no longer simply a matter of convenience, but also a matter of resilience. So I personally believe that the point has been emphatically made that we can no longer do business as usual anywhere in the developing world in particular. So I think for these reasons, I also believe that digital payments and eventually digital currencies have a very important role to play in sub-regional development in places like the Caribbean or the Pacific. These are small island states and they have extra challenges, structural challenges. So not just in terms of shaping how island state businesses emerge from the challenges that they're facing during this pandemic, but also more generally in terms of how developing and evolving economies organize as a society. That's the importance that I see for digital payments. Our posture to technology too, for example, really has to change. I think that the imperative for e-commerce has always been kind of amplified. Everybody wants to talk about e-commerce, but digital currencies and digital currencies are just a simple way to make payments faster, more cost effective, and secure. So this is critical for a region that's so dependent on remittances as well as trade and services. This is a region that I think the World Bank has said that 1/3 of the labor force in developing economies, 1/3 are going to lose their jobs. Not to mention losses in the informal economy, who cater both to those in the formal economy during COVID, right? And in the informal economy. So some are advocating that one way to stimulate the economies of developing or evolving countries is through offering digital solutions that meet public needs at a reasonable cost. This still allows companies to earn profits, but they're doing it in a way that is more transparent. So these digital currencies, these digital payments are among the emerging industries that can pull evolving economies out of the current trench they're in and help facilitate trade. I think the question remains, how do we leverage this?
And then, I mean, we've all seen the ICOs, right? The hype with all these digital currencies since 2009 when Bitcoin came into existence. And then a lot of people have been introducing these new projects, and all of a sudden countries become very much aware of this whole thing. And here, for example, in Europe, what's fascinating to me is that only one country really provides the cryptocurrency license, which serves as a passporting, and that is Estonia. I mean, you do have other countries as well, right, offering different types of regulations, but quite often the lack of it or the existing regulation as is stifles the innovation. So my question to you would be, what are the legal gaps or the obstacles on the road that these companies or the countries, vice versa, find, and in which, of course, these companies operate, that all of us, the companies and the countries, would actually need to overcome in order to, you know, galvanize or access the digital currencies and really start using them on the market?
That's another great question. Before I answer it, I just want to go back to something that you were saying about how Estonia is the only one that really has this going in Europe, and that's, you know, a surprise because almost all of Europe is industrialized, and so in the developed country category. Look, businesses particularly in the evolving economies, they may have contemplated a couple of days of displacement because of a hurricane or a typhoon or an earthquake, but never once did anybody foresee a lockdown of the magnitude that we're experiencing now. So I expect that we will generally see more interest in technology, not just digital payments, but technology in general as a means of supporting business continuity. And so I trust that this time of COVID is going to have a profound impact on both businesses and consumers, on how they think and how they evaluate their choices for years to come. And I think that you're going to see many more countries being aware that there's a significant need for this, because this is one pandemic, and we may get out of it the way Wuhan already has, or other countries are doing well in, but we may see either an acceleration or another pandemic. These types of issues are growing because the climate is changing, the world is changing, travel is changing. People are able to more easily and democratically, I would say, get from one place, their country of origin, to somewhere else. And so with them comes not just their wonderful culture and everything good, but also some of these health challenges and ways of looking at the world and engaging with the environment that's different than maybe where they go, and that brings maybe, you know, changes in health. And so yes, definitely we need to talk about the legal gaps, but we also need to look at technology for business as something important to business continuity, because we're going to see other types of pandemics and other major crises, I think, in our lifetime because of the way that the world and globalization is working. So now to get to your question, what are the legal gaps that companies and countries in which they operate have to overcome in order to actually get access to these digital currencies and start using them in digital payments? I mean, the truth is that, you know, we've already, ordinary men and women have found ways to access the convenience of digital payments kind of long before even the private sector, much less kind of waiting for governments to do it. For example, using phone credit as an exchange of value on the African continent has been popular now, I would say probably for 2 decades now, at this point, definitely since the turn of the century. So in order to harness, I think, the true potential of technology, we need to create an enabling environment, really. And this is one of the things that I mentioned in my slide earlier when I talked about being adaptive, innovative, and creative, or adaptive, creative, and innovative. The same financial inclusion that underpins at least 8 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and that require buy-in of governments and central banks and commercial banks and other licensed financial institutions, and as well as merchants and consumers, we need to apply that same kind of financial inclusion and framework. In the interim, we need models that work so that others can be inspired and see themselves reflected. You can't be what you can't see, goes the old saying. So take, for example, the popular and well-known Caribbean destination of Barbados. They recently, you may know them because they recently created a nomad visa where people who work digitally, virtually, are able to get a visa to live and work in the Bahamas for 1 year. Normally it would be, restricted to 3 months as a tourist, and you wouldn't even be able to work there. But now you can, because they've created this special category. That's a wonderful example of governments being creative. In Barbados, there is a small company called BIT Industries, or BIT Incorporated. They've worked with the government there to deploy a digital currency known as M-Money. I saw it in action last year when I was on vacation in Barbados around March with my husband. M-Money has been deployed locally with great success as a proof of concept, because it started as a pilot. BIT built it from the ground up to show central banks and licensed financial institutions what a world with digital currencies could look like in what is considered a developing economy. It's a middle income country, but it is considered a developing economy according to the World Bank standard that I mentioned to you a little bit earlier. They earn, the GNI is 11,900 US or less, and the overall financial well-being is low. So technology can be licensed today by corporate groups, commercial banks, credit unions, et cetera. There's really no legislative prohibition against it. Why it's not being used, I think, is what I said earlier. If people can't be what they can't see. So we need to bring it to the forefront. It needs to become a standard. And to do that, we need to show pilots in different countries that are working. The company I mentioned earlier, BIT, has had the privilege of supporting the deployment of kind of like a top-down approach in the Eastern Caribbean, where the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank resolved to engage in a digital currency pilot. So because the political and the institutional will existed, access is being granted throughout an ecosystem of pilot countries. So I say all that to say it really depends. To answer the question, it depends on what the political will is, what the institutional will is, who's leading it. Industry usually moves faster than government, right? So industry will move faster than regulation, as this space has already proven. But the legislation is catching up, and regulators are using concepts such as sandboxes or pilots to inform their views. And I think it's quite healthy what's happening in this ecosystem. Companies can, in the interim, use their membership in trade associations, in chambers of commerce, to approach governments and banks to take advantage of solutions like M-Money in the Caribbean and similar software that's being introduced in other regions, so that they can start introducing efficiencies, particularly during this time where people are unable to move around physically as easy as they could before. So this would make everything so much easier. It just needs to be scaled. And to scale it, you need to first start seeing it, understanding what it is, how it works. And maybe the fact that industry is leading it instead of government is a good thing, because industry is usually more agile and more flexible. So they can also let government representatives know that they wish to see the introduction of digital currencies at the national level. And though I recognize that this is something that will take time, and it can't happen before its time. It's already starting to happen slowly. So you and I have work to do to educate, enable, empower others to know about these technologies and start exploring where they are used successfully and then how to replicate them in our own countries.
Absolutely agree. I mean, far too often on these conferences, when you visit the, blockchain community, more or less people are just, simple geeks. It's not really that you see a lot of these diverse interdisciplinary dialogues. And that maybe leads me to the third question that we have for you. And that is, what should happen in the international agency development agenda to attract more investments and have a bigger pool of talent, like altogether a diversity to digital currencies and payment? To kind of limit these economic shocks moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things have to happen. I already mentioned two of them, the political will and then industry kind of taking the lead because they're more agile. But I'd also like to say that we probably need to see a cultural shift in our attitude towards what countries can and can't do, particularly what developing and evolving economies can be expected to achieve in terms of technology today. There's this idea that developing countries need to be given extra external consultants to show them how to do things through training and technical papers, and then they'll get on board. And then when they don't, they're seen as slow. And this is what brings that shame that I started my discussion about earlier. So we need to shift that cultural perception of what certain countries can do and other countries can do. All countries can do it. It's a question of political will, institutional leadership, and setting up the framework for it to happen, the technology framework. And we know that framework exists. We just have to get it. Second, I think we need a shift in what we expect from technology. We need to recognize that there are limitations to technology, but also the importance of building technology aspects into national development plans, national development agencies, and in business continuity plans, again, particularly for evolving nations. And you'll forgive me if I focus so much on evolving nations. I do recognize that there are many people on this call from industrialized nations, but I explained at the beginning why it's so important to me that we focus on these evolving nations, because there are 195 countries in the world, but 137 of them are developing nations, or evolving nations, as I like to call them. So you can't move forward if those countries aren't on board. So they need to have in their national development plans technology and the introduction of technology, digital payments, digital currencies being one aspect. And I would say third, and one of the most important things, is diversification. Both diversification of thought, number one, but also developing economies have to diversify what services and products they offer to the world. When we think about island states, whether it be in the Pacific or whether it be in the Caribbean, the first thing we think about is tourism. We cannot put our collective eggs still into tourism, in the tourism basket. It's not going to work. Look what's happening with COVID. Look how devastated the tourism industry has been and continues to be. And still, we don't even know when it's going to get better. We need to invest in collective self-reliance in developing countries, which means deeper integration along sub-regional lines in those particular regions, but also deeper collaboration with both the private sector in neighboring countries and in local economies, but also outside of that, in the big wide world in which we all live, to facilitate this kind of synthetic monetary union. We need digital currencies on the development agenda. We need to move beyond traditional industries and invest in our human capital so that we are retooled and ready to build and lead with new technological industries from the developing world, not just from outside in. There are many evolving countries that could become a research and development hub, or be movers and shakers, like Barbados has been one of the first in this area. So those countries need to position themselves, and their policymakers need to recognize the importance of having that leadership so that they can move forward in the technology space.
Magda, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm sold. I'm moving to Barbados. That's it. For that 1 year, I want to go. I'm going to be a
fabulous place. Absolutely. You can be a digital nomad, and I totally support it. And they've got this digital currency going. I believe that these types of strategies, the things that we've just laid out in this talk, and I want to be respectful of the time we had, and I think there may be some questions. I believe that these types of strategies, those are the things that are going to attract investment. They're going to create a bigger pool of local talent, and they're going to support diversification into digital currencies, into digital payments, to limit the economic shocks of today, but also the economic shocks that are sure to come in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this presentation. I actually believe that it very closely connects to our next two presentations as well. With us, there's going to be Michel Sappa talking about cities, research initiative, and urban innovation. But knowing what he does, there's going to be a lot of overlapping just about how do we move towards innovation and technology, and how do we communicate that with a policymaker. I think it has a lot to do with what you just discussed. Hello, and thank you for joining. And then the third talk in a row is going to be about the DeFi, that means decentralized finances, provided by Aaron Wright. So, I mean, you know, there's so much overlapping with these talks that I really just see like, okay, this is a good positioning of our keynote speakers.
Anya, so, great minds think alike. That's what it is. Or fools seldom differ. That's what they say. So it's one or the other.
True. Thank you for the presentation. The video is going to be uploaded and available to everybody who has the access to the replays. Please stay with us. There's going to be yet another presentation, and we're going to be here for another hour and a half.
Thank you for letting me share this as well, Anya. I want to thank you. I want to thank the Future Law Summit organizers. And one of the reasons I particularly want to thank you is because you recognize that one doesn't have to be an expert in order to make change. One has to be informed, one has to be aware, but one can share one's knowledge and one's ideas in a format like this to be able to have a real impact in how the world moves forward after this crisis. And for that, I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.